Good evening. I'm Pastor David Youth, Senior Pastor here at First Baptist, and I want to welcome you to an amazing evening. I don't think in 1871, when this church started, they saw a night like this. In fact, I'm pretty sure they didn't. But we're so glad to see this night because of the conversation, because of what we will hear together and what we will do together. You see, we at First Baptist are passionate followers of Jesus Christ, unashamedly. And we believe that he taught we're to love even our enemies. That is not to assume any of our enemies would be here tonight. It is just simply to say what love does and how we must love. And so to open our doors to this community in this way, it's a no-brainer. This is what Jesus would do. And so we welcome you, and we're really glad to have you. He also taught a golden rule that goes something like this: do unto others what you would want them to do unto you. You know, I would want you to stand up for my right to practice my faith. I would want you to fight for my religious freedom. And so I'm going to fight for yours. And we will do that together. There is no sense to the idea of standing for religious freedom if all you're doing is standing for your own. It doesn't make sense. It's a contradiction. For you to really exercise a stand for religious freedom is to stand for those who are different than you. And that's when you really become, I believe, one who is a champion of what we're here to talk about tonight. I serve on the International Mission Board. I served as the chairman of the board for 2 years and still a member of the board. We manage 4,000 missionaries all over the world. I can tell you that the most dangerous places we have missionaries are those places where there is no religious freedom. So why shouldn't I stand with you for the right to exercise our First Amendment right, to the right to practice your faith as you are convicted to do so? So it's for that reason I am very glad to host this and for you to be a part of this evening. I know you've probably heard about it. You've read about it. It happened over the weekend. A mosque in Victoria, Texas was burned. And the most amazing thing happened in that town. People came from everywhere to stand for those who worshiped there. In fact, on Sunday night, over 400 gathered in front of the mosque. There were Jews, there were Christians, there were Muslims, and I'm sure there were those who were none, had no faith, but they stood together. And the most amazing thing happened, they prayed together. And you know, the paper picked it up. I've got a Washington Post article in my hand. And it's just astounding to some of the media that would happen. And the things that then have happened since then. They've raised over $1 million, I think $1.2 million to help rebuild that mosque. But the most amazing thing to me is what one of the members of the synagogue there, a Jewish man, said when the media gave him his chance and he had the opportunity to speak. Now he's standing with this burned down mosque behind him and the crowd in front of him and the media there. Listen to what he said. He said, whether this was a kitchen fire or short circuit or a psychopath, the result of the spark is not what stands behind me. It's what stands before me. The result of the spark is not a building burned down, but a crowd gathered to stand together. Well, that's who we are tonight. And whether it was the result of the spark of the threats against religious freedom in this country or not, I'm just glad we are here together. And I welcome you. You're going to enjoy this evening. And I would just say we want to be a blessing to you here at First Baptist. I shared with our faith leaders. If you'd like to, 2 years ago, to honor my 10th anniversary, the church installed a fountain, a beautiful fountain, out in the lake right behind you out here. Now, my last name is Youth, so it is called the Fountain of Youth. If you'd like to stop by and have a drink. Maybe that'll bless your evening even more. You'd never know I'm 93 years old. It works. May the Lord bless you. Have a wonderful evening, and thank you. And now, would you give a great hand of welcome to the three wise guys?
Good evening.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Good evening. How are you tonight? It's great. We want a lot of energy in the room tonight because we're going to be hearing tonight from some wonderful people who have a lot of important information to share, important perspectives. And it's sort of like what we do, right, Rev, what we do on the show?
It is. We fight with each other regularly. It is wonderful, and we want to thank Pastor Youth and all of the staff here at First Baptist Church for the hosting of this event. We're so grateful to be here tonight. And there was a dinner for some of the clergy beforehand, because that's how you get clergy to come to things, as you feed them. And so when Danny Darmus and I were talking about food, he said, well, what? I said, oh, just, anything with pork for the rabbi and imam. They love that. So anyway, but part of religious sensibility really is understanding those kinds of things about our sisters and brothers from other traditions. And that's part of what tonight is about, to celebrate that diversity that we share and to really take this time to think about what we mean. And we're going to have different viewpoints, right? That's going to be part of tonight. That's part of what the show is about, as the rabbi started talking about, is that we often don't agree, but we are always friends, first of all, and that creates a civil conversation in which we can really learn and understand each other better.
And speaking about that, how many of you think that with what's going on in our country now that we're going to be having a lot of conversations pretty soon or right now? Yes? So what we want to model tonight is for what we hope will happen in the future in our country is that we can have real conversations with each other, that we can speak our mind, that we know that faith is going to be at the table. The three of us have different opinions about things in our faiths and perhaps about the way we see the world, but one thing we agree upon is that in these conversations, we shouldn't leave out faith. Faith should have a voice at our national table. Anyone who says that faith isn't involved in whatever way you want to say it, politics, government, whatever it is absolutely wrong, because our values come from our faith perspective, and many of the issues that we discuss in our country have to do with values. So shouldn't faith be at the table to have the conversation? We agree that it should.
Well, I want to reiterate our thanks to First Baptist for taking the lead on this. Pastor David, Youth. By the way, this is from the fountain. It's
Actually, the imam is 120 years old.
It's $10 outside. And to my great friend, Pastor Danny Darmus, for hosting us here tonight and for really making great strides to bring so many people from across Central Florida and also hosting our guests from across the country who will be our expert speakers tonight. They will inform us, they will open our minds, and they will help us understand the complicated issues that we have in a very civilized way. And for that, we want to introduce our first speaker.
So our first speaker tonight will be Hannah Smith. She's the senior counsel at the Becket Fund for Religious Liberty. She comes from Washington, D.C., I think. Are you from Washington, Hannah? Yeah. And her topic is recent and upcoming Supreme Court decisions and their impacts on religious freedom. She'll be followed immediately by
Mike Batts. Mike is a managing partner at Batts, Morrison, Wales, and Lee here in Orlando. It's an accounting firm, but he does much more than that. Mike deals with the topic of government and regulations of political expression by religious organizations, why the status quo is untenable, and proposed solutions. And he's going to talk to us a little bit about this issue of how much can we speak about politics in the church, the synagogue, the mosque, the house of worship? What are the limits? What are the boundaries? And can we maintain the current status quo? So I think you'll be very interested in his words as well. As part of the conversation tonight, just to remind you that around the room there are baskets. We want you to be part of the discussion tonight. If you have a question as you're listening to a speaker, we want you to find one of the people that are walking around the room. There are baskets right over there, for instance, on the tables.
In the corner.
There are 4 tables in the corners. Feel free to stand up, go over there, write your question on an index card, put your question in there, because we want you to be part of our conversation tonight, to involve you as we dialogue with the speakers in a special way.
So we'll begin with our first 2 speakers, Hannah, and then followed immediately by Mike, and then we'll come back up to introduce the next speakers.
Thank you.
It's great to be with you here tonight. Thank you so much for being here, for making time out of your schedules to come and discuss this important issue together. I'm really impressed by the coordination and the organizers of this event. It's quite impressive to see so many different faith groups gathered here tonight. I work at the Becket Fund for Religious Liberty. It's a very unique organization, and we work on some of the most interesting religious liberty cases of our time. The Becket Fund was founded in 1994 by a devout Catholic, Seamus Hassan, and it's a nonprofit, nonpartisan public interest law firm that defends religious liberty for all. And when we say that, we really mean it, from A to Z, from Anglicans and agnostics to Zoroastrians. We have represented Sikhs and Muslims and Jews and Christians, because, as was mentioned earlier, we truly do need to stand up for each other to defend this important principle of religious freedom. What I want to talk about a little bit tonight are what are the most important pressing issues that are facing people of faith right now? What are the cases that we are litigating around the country that define the battlefront, if you will, for religious freedom? So I'm going to start first by talking about the first area of concern, which is government mandates. Many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the headlines in the news over the last several years under the Affordable Care Act and various mandates, including the HHS contraception mandate, including the more recent transgender mandates, these mandates that impose duties on religious people that violate their convictions, and do so with the threat of crippling fines, and in some cases, lawsuits and losing their jobs. So these kinds of mandates are troublesome for many reasons, but we were very successful in representing the Green family in the Hobby Lobby case before the Supreme Court in winning them a 5-4 decision to get an exemption from the HHS mandate, and also the Little Sisters of the Poor in Zubik v. Burwell, which was an important case for the nonprofit religious ministries who were struggling with this mandate as well. The second area of concern that I want to talk to you a little bit about tonight is religious autonomy. And this area of concern is the effort by some to restrict the freedom of churches and other faith-based organizations to organize, to choose their own leaders based on religious criteria that's free from government intrusion. We represented the Hosanna Tabor Lutheran Church and School at the Supreme Court. It was a really important case involving the ministerial exception, which is a doctrine under the First Amendment that says that, religious organizations, churches, they really should be free to choose their own ministers, free from government telling them who should be their ministers under anti-discrimination laws. The government actually argued in that case, quite astonishingly, that churches should be treated no differently than the Elks Lodge or another secular group. That argument met with astonishment, not just from Justice Scalia, but from Justice Kagan, who both said that is astonishing that you think that the First Amendment has no implication here when we're talking about this core right of churches to be able to choose their ministers. So in a unanimous opinion, the Supreme Court rejected the administration's position as extreme, remarkable, and untenable. And instead, the Supreme Court confirmed that this ministerial exception protects very broadly the right of churches and other faith-based organizations to choose their leaders, free from any government intervention or intrusion. So the third area of concern is really closely related to the second, and it's also based on a Supreme Court ruling that some of you probably heard about, Christian Legal Society v. Martinez. And that ruling didn't turn out so well at the Supreme Court. It was a couple years before Hosanna Tabor. But the court upheld something there called an all-comers policy at a publicly funded law school out in California that required student groups to accept anyone into their group's membership and their leadership ranks. So if you were a Catholic student group at this public law school, you had to accept an atheist into your membership, and you even had to accept an atheist as the president of your group. Now, administrations at many state-funded and even at many private universities that are not bound by this ruling are now using this decision to create and enforce even more strict similar policies to this one. And these types of policies, I'm sure you've seen in the headlines, are driving religious groups off campus. A prominent example was at Vanderbilt, where religious groups were literally forced off of campus because of policies similar to this that were implemented by their administration. The fourth area of concern is religious land use. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with this, perhaps because of your own experience with your own faith group. But this involves discrimination against churches, synagogues, and mosques that want to use privately owned property or to access public property on equal terms with secular groups. Now, in this area, we represented the Islamic Center of Murfreesboro in Tennessee. And this particular community of Muslims had been part of this local community for about 30 years. But about 7 years ago, back in 2010, they actually sought to build a new mosque, to accommodate their larger numbers. But they were met with very hostile protests from a small group of local residents who claimed that this congregation was threatening simply because they were Muslim. And this hostility actually included several acts of vandalism, and there were even some arson and bomb threats, which resulted in a federal indictment. So it was really a scary situation for that mosque. The opposition eventually reached the courts, as these types of cases often do, and those who opposed the mosque filed a state court lawsuit. And even though the County Planning Commission approved this new mosque at a regular meeting with regular public notice, the state court judge held that that regular notice was not sufficient in this case. Because of the, quote, tremendous public interest surrounding the mosque, the judge decided that the County Planning Commission's decision in this matter should have met a heightened legal standard. So we filed a federal lawsuit. We were joined by the Department of Justice, and we requested that that Islamic community be permitted to complete their building in time for Ramadan. And we prevailed. And I think it was a really important victory for that mosque, but also for mosques around the country. The next category I want to talk a little bit about is the intersection of conscience rights and same-sex marriage. And I think this area obviously concerns the protection of religious business owners and professionals who could face penalties for declining to provide services in support of same-sex weddings based on their religious belief in traditional marriage. So on the issue of same-sex marriage, we at Beckett Fund don't take a particular position per se, but we do take a position that religious exemptions should be built into laws to provide a sufficiently robust protection for religious persons. So about 10 years ago, we convened an important conference with noted First Amendment scholars who wrote articles that became a book that I would recommend to any of you who are interested in this subject. It's available on Amazon. It's called Emerging Conflicts, and it really is the touchstone of scholarly discourse on this subject. So I would encourage you, if you have an interest in this area, to go home and get a copy of that book. And I think we're seeing now, especially post-Obergefell, many of these issues starting to play out exactly as they were predicted by those scholars 10 years ago. Finally, another area of concern is the effort by some to expunge all evidence of religion from the public square. And I think many of you are familiar with the yearly battles over nativities and other displays of religion in the public square. There are many examples of this. One of them that's been very important to the Beckett Fund is the attempt by some to strip the words "under God," one nation under God, out of our Pledge of Allegiance. Or another example of this is the effort by some to discontinue our nation's long tradition of legislative prayer. Indeed, there was a case at the Supreme Court recently called Town of Greece v. Galloway, which dealt with this issue of legislative prayer and upheld the practice largely due to our nation's long history of legislative prayer. So there are also cases about removing religious symbols, whether they be roadside crosses or statues of Jesus, that were established by veterans groups as memorials. So for many years, we have been very active in this area in defending the words "one nation under God" in the Pledge of Allegiance. Various groups have brought lawsuits across the country, from California to New Hampshire to Massachusetts to New Jersey, and we've been successful in defending the pledge in each one of these cases. Another area of concern that I want to touch briefly on tonight is something that you may not be as familiar with. They are state constitutional provisions known as Blaine Amendments, and they are rooted in discrimination against faith communities. The Supreme Court has actually recognized this in a couple of opinions, that they've stated that these provisions were born of bigotry and they should be buried now. And these Blaine Amendments, although they started with an anti-Catholic basis, are now used to discriminate against many different religious communities, to block public funding from going to any religious group or religious nonprofit. For example, these are implicated in school choice programs. They're also implicated in other religious nonprofits that perhaps compete for grant funding to provide rehabilitation to prisoners, for example. We had a case involving a halfway house for prisoners, and we actually won that case on behalf of the religious nonprofit. The most recent example of this is the current case that's before the Supreme Court this term, the Trinity Lutheran Church of Columbia, Missouri versus Pauley. And that case should be argued soon before the court, but it involves a similar state Blaine Amendment in Missouri, where the state opened up public funding for preschools and daycares and parks to refurbish their playgrounds and receive state funding to do it. But they said, if you're a religious group, you can't do this. And they said, we have a state constitutional provision that says we can't give funds to religious groups. And we argued before the Supreme Court in our amicus brief that that wasn't consistent with the First Amendment. The next area of concern that I want to raise is government intrusion on minority religious rights. And I just want to highlight two cases here that we worked on recently that I think illustrate why it's so important to stand up for people of all faiths. First is Pastor Soto and his eagle feathers. In 2006, the government sent undercover agents to a Native American religious ceremony called a powwow to confiscate eagle feathers, which play a central role in the Native American faith. The agent was enforcing federal laws that prohibit possession of eagle feathers without a permit. The laws grant permits to museums, scientists, zoos, and farmers. They also grant permits to Native Americans who are members of federally recognized tribes, but they don't grant permits to Mr. Soto's tribe, Lillipon Apache of Texas, because they're not federally recognized. They're recognized by historians, sociologists, even the state of Texas recognizes them as a tribe, but they are not recognized by the federal government. And so they don't receive a whole host of benefits that the federal government gives to tribes that are so designated. So Mr. Soto challenged this arbitrary treatment under the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, a very important federal statute that protects the rights of religious communities. And it was the same law, actually, that was at issue in Hobby Lobby. So it's interesting that the Green family, a Christian family that won the Hobby Lobby case, that precedent was later used to help a Native American pastor protect his religious rights. And the government, in the end, largely due to our lawsuit, returned Mr. Soto's eagle feathers. And we were able to get that tribe some relief, and they're able to use their eagle feathers in their powwows again, as they wanted to all along. The final area that I want to talk a little bit about tonight is religious freedom for prisoners. Now, this is not a topic that you probably think a lot about, but it's something that is really important to consider, that even people who break our laws and who are in prison still deserve the human dignity of being able to find religion in prison and practice their beliefs accordingly. So the Beckett Fund has represented several different prisoners in Jewish kosher meal cases, one here in Florida, and we've also dealt with prisoner rights cases involving Muslim beards, the most prominent of which was the Holt v. Hobbs case, which we took to the Supreme Court and also got a unanimous victory there. It was under the Federal Civil Rights Statute, the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act. Interesting statute that couples land use with institutionalized persons, but protects the religious exercise in both those areas. And this particular Muslim prisoner had been denied permission to grow a half-inch beard that his Muslim faith required, even though Arkansas had already permitted beards to be worn for medical reasons, and even though a half-inch beard is permissible in over 40 state prison systems and the federal prison system. So in a 9-0 opinion, the court found in favor of our client, Mr. Muhammad, and protected his right to practice his faith even while he's incarcerated. So I hope this has given you a framework, a sort of survey of the kinds of religious liberty issues that we are dealing with across the country. And I think you'll see that these examples demonstrate that religious liberty touches every faith community in our country. These kinds of concerns and these kinds of challenges are real for everyone, for Christians, for Jews, for Sikhs, for Muslims, for people of all faith. And I am glad to report that we're making significant progress in litigating these cases and protecting the fundamental rights of religious liberty. And I thank you again for being here tonight, and I look forward to hearing the rest of the panel. Thank you so much.
Good evening. From the founding of our country in 1776, and for 178 years thereafter, churches and other tax-exempt religious organizations had the freedom to engage as they saw fit in political discourse in the United States of America. Having that freedom caused no problems, and there is no historical narrative that such freedom damaged our religious institutions or our country. There are many who would say that such freedom made our country better and stronger. In 1954, that changed when then Senator Lyndon B. Johnson successfully proposed what we now call the Johnson Amendment on the floor of the U.S. Senate as an add-on to the rewrite of the Internal Revenue Code in 1954. LBJ's proposed amendment was adopted with no debate, no committee discussions, and no explanation of its tax policy purpose. That is, no official description of why he thought it was the right thing to do. The Johnson Amendment became law, part of Section 501c3 of the Internal Revenue Code, and in its current form prohibits churches, charities, schools, and other nonprofit organizations described in that code section from participating in or intervening in a political campaign, including making statements endorsing or opposing any candidate for political office. The IRS can impose fines or revoke the tax-exempt status of any church, house of worship, or charity that violates this law. Very reliable sources have reported that LBJ introduced this amendment to the law as a result of opposition to his reelection by a nonprofit tax-exempt organization. A detailed account of the history surrounding the amendment is set forth in a scholarly article in the Boston College Law Review from July of 2001. While the absence of the Johnson Amendment prior to 1954 presented no notable legal challenges or problems, the same most certainly cannot be said about its presence since 1954. The situation today with the Johnson Amendment as applied by the Internal Revenue Service is untenable. Many constitutional law attorneys believe that the law is unconstitutional. Why is the current status of the Johnson Amendment law untenable? First, the law, as interpreted and applied by the Internal Revenue Service, is vague. The IRS's own published guidance states that all of the facts and circumstances must be taken into consideration in determining whether an organization's communications about moral or social issues constitute prohibited political activity. The IRS says that even if a church leader or a member of the clergy doesn't name a candidate or mention a campaign, commentary about a social issue or a moral issue may violate the law, depending on what is said, when it is said, and how it is said. Consequently, religious and nonprofit leaders are never quite sure where the lines of demarcation are. And the effect of that is to chill free speech, often in the context of exercising religion. The content of a sermon or a religious worship service embodies First Amendment rights like virtually nothing else. A law that permits U.S. government officials to evaluate the content of a minister's sermon to determine whether it is appropriate is inherently problematic. It is hard to imagine any law that is more of an affront to the First Amendment of our Constitution. In addition to the problem of stifling permissible speech, another untenable aspect of the law is the fact that large swaths of churches in the United States ignore and or defy the law with impunity. A First Amendment defense organization named Alliance Defending Freedom, ADF, sponsors an initiative that they call Pulpit Freedom Sunday, held every year since 2008. On Pulpit Freedom Sunday, participating pastors deliver sermons about candidates or campaigns. Many of them send transcripts of their sermons to the Internal Revenue Service, and they ask to be audited in the hope that the church, with ADF's help, will be able to litigate the constitutionality of the law in the courts. ADF says that more than 2,000 pastors have violated the Johnson Amendment law via Pulpit Freedom Sunday since it started in 2008, and not one of those churches has had any adverse enforcement action by the Internal Revenue Service. Separately, Pew Research issued a report in October of 2012 stating that African American churchgoers are 8 times as likely to hear a sermon in church favoring a particular candidate than their white mainline Protestant counterparts. In fact, that same Pew Research report stated the following in connection with the 2012 election cycle, and I quote, "Nearly half, 45% of black Protestant churchgoers say the messages they hear at church favor a candidate, and every one of those says the message favors, in that case, Obama." End of quote. 45%. This happens openly in every election cycle. No reasonable person denies that. And yet, there are no consequences. Why? Because there should not be any consequences. Does it really make sense for the IRS to attempt to revoke the tax-exempt status of half of the black churches in the United States of America? Of course not. Does it really make sense for the IRS to attempt to force black churches to stop doing something that is deeply steeped in their culture? Of course not. Anyone who is intellectually honest knows that there is no way that our government should or will attempt to stop the mass of churches in America who speak about political campaigns or candidates in every election cycle. And anyone who is intellectually honest knows that as long as that is true, the Johnson Amendment law is utterly unenforceable. Yet, the IRS continues to tell churches and charities not to engage in campaign-related communications because they violate the law. And many law-abiding churches and houses of worship abide by that law no matter what they may be called to say or do. In response to a request by U.S. Senator Charles Grassley, the Evangelical Council for Financial Accountability, ECFA, formed a national commission in 2011 that addressed the Johnson Amendment. ECFA asked me to chair that commission, and I did. The Commission on Accountability and Policy for Religious Organizations involved leaders from every major faith group in the United States, as well as a cross-section of secular charity leaders and a panel of legal experts. The Commission addressed the untenable nature of the Johnson Amendment law and issued a report with its recommendations for Congress and the Treasury Department in 2013. The Commission concluded that members of the clergy should be completely free to say whatever they believe is appropriate in the context of a religious worship service, even if their speech relates to political candidates or campaigns. The Commission further rationalized that if such freedom were to apply to churches and religious organizations, the same freedom should apply to all public charities. The Commission developed a novel recommended solution that protects and preserves the tax policy principle of not allowing tax-deductible contributions to be expended for political campaign activities. Specifically, the Commission recommended that the law allow churches and charities to engage in what we called no-cost political communications. No-cost political communications are communications about political campaigns or candidates that are made in the ordinary course of an organization's regular and customary exempt activities and that do not involve an incremental expenditure of funds. The classic example of this would be a sermon in a worship service. The church or the house of worship is going to have a worship service. A minister is going to deliver a sermon. If during that sermon the minister chooses to spend 5 minutes or 10 minutes talking about a candidate or a campaign, there is no incremental expenditure of funds involved in that communication. If adopted, the Commission's recommendation would solve virtually all of the vexing problems that currently exist in administering the Johnson Amendment law. No longer would there be a law that allows the Internal Revenue Service to fine or penalize a church for the content of its worship services. Some argue in response that giving up the liberty to express views on political candidates is necessary if an organization is to have tax-exempt status. Such logic is inherently and woefully flawed. While it may sound logical on its face, the idea that an entity must be willing to surrender one of its most fundamental, constitutionally protected rights in exchange for a tax benefit is actually completely illogical. It would make just as much sense to have a law that says that taxpayers who take a deduction on their tax returns for mortgage interest expense should not be allowed to vote. Obviously, that is ludicrous, but that is a tax benefit that taxpayers receive. When Commission leaders spoke with groups who opposed the Johnson Amendment law, it became clear that such groups are not seeking the ability to take tax-deductible contributions and use them to make political campaign expenditures. Rather, they are simply seeking the unmitigated freedom to say what they want to say. Some say that if churches and charities are permitted to engage in political campaign communications, there will be a mad rush by churches and charities to do just that. And that our churches and our charities will become political institutions. We need only to look at the current laws that exist today related to lobbying to see that such a concern is not warranted. Churches and charities have always been permitted to engage in lobbying related to proposed legislation within certain limits. If churches and charities are so politically inclined that they're chomping at the bit to have the gates opened for political campaign communications, those churches and charities would already be fully engaged in the lobbying arena. In reality, very few churches and charities engage in lobbying activities. It is true that some people don't like the idea of lifting the political activity ban for churches and charities even a little. The Commission believed that rather than having the government dictate what a church or charity can say, each organization's leaders, members, and donors should have the freedom to make that decision for themselves. Having the freedom to do something does not, of course, create an obligation to do it. Opinions will vary significantly from one church or charity to another as to whether it is in the organization's best interests to engage in political communications. Many will wisely conclude that it is not, but that determination should be made by each organization, taking into consideration the unique factors that affect it and its constituencies. Legislation has been filed in Congress that would implement the Commission's core recommendation of allowing houses of worship and charities to engage in no-cost political communications. The Republican Party stated in its 2016 platform that it supports repealing the Johnson Amendment. Republicans now comprise a majority of both houses of Congress. President Trump has stated publicly that he wants to repeal the Johnson Amendment. We are witnessing the first time since 1954 that there is a significant chance the Johnson Amendment law as we know it could come to an end. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Mike. Well, we on the show obviously express our opinions all the time, and we are glad the IRS has not visited us yet.
Yeah.
Well, I have to say,
Yeah.
I was going to say, Imam, with
Because
law,
we have a lot of money, right?
Right.
well, no,
yeah.
I was going to say, law or no
tons.
law, my congregation would not allow me to get up, and they would have something to say about that, wouldn't they?
Probably so. Yeah.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. What do you say about when there are 4 Jews in a room? There.
8 opinions.
Yeah. Okay. That's right. Yeah. So
That's a tough one.
that's true.
That's tough.
That's true of Protestants as well. Otherwise, we wouldn't have 40,000 denominations. So, great. We public service announcement. Quick public service announcement before the introduction of our next speakers. Tonight, of course, our event focuses on religious freedom, and the request by the committee is please don't wander from that topic. As you're preparing your questions, be thinking about this, because in light of the immigration issues of the past week, it's important that we not let this religious freedom event become a discussion on U.S. immigration policy, is the request. So that's a discussion for another day, and maybe we'll have another summit talking about that. But for today, this one. So that's our public service announcement. And remember, there are 4 tables around the corners for your questions. Feel free to get up. We want you to feel relaxed just to get up and move around as you have questions and get those in. And Imam?
We're going to collect those questions and go through them because many people may ask the same question. We will have one version of that. Hopefully, our speakers will be able to address different angles of that question, because we can't have several hundred questions answered in the time allotted. But we will do our best to sort through these questions and cover as many areas as possible. If you start now making your questions and turning them in, then the screeners will be able to sort them out just in time for our speakers to answer them. Some of our speakers will be excused to do interviews because we will be at 8 o'clock hearing about the new nominee for Supreme Justice. And we will announce who is the nominee if we hear that. But now we're going to introduce the next 3 speakers who will be first Imam Abdullah Antepli. He is the Chief Representative of Muslim Affairs at Duke University. He is an adjunct faculty of Islamic Studies and his topic is a discussion of the current political climate and challenges and opportunities that these contemporary realities present for us, especially for the faith communities in the U.S. He will share his fears and hopes in this regard.
And following the Imam will be Professor Cole Durham. Professor Cole Durham Jr. is Professor of Law at Brigham Young University. He's the founding director of the International Center for Law and Religion Studies, which was organized to provide an institutional base for long-term initiatives in the field of law and religion throughout the world. He's currently the president of the International Consortium for Law and Religion Studies, ICLARS, and it's based in Milan, Italy, and co-editor-in-chief of the Oxford Journal of Law and Religion. Professor Durham's been involved in constitutional drafting projects in Nepal, Thailand, and Iraq, and has worked on constitutional and statutory drafting projects throughout Eastern Europe and in most former Soviet bloc countries as well.
And as you have noticed that the imam was able to introduce an imam, I will in a moment introduce Rabbi Goldfeder. You notice that Reverend Fallwider, as a congregational minister, I don't think you have a chance of teaching at Brigham Young.
Yeah, well, I don't know. You know, we'll see.
I just don't think
I mean,
so.
you know, yeah. Not in law, I'll tell you
It's
that.
a pleasure to introduce Rabbi Mark Goldfeder. He is director of Restoring Religious Freedom Project at Emory University. He is also a senior lecturer at Emory Law School and Sproul Family Senior Fellow at the Center for the Study of Law and Religion. He is editor of the Cambridge University Press series on law and Judaism and specializes in the First Amendment. I personally have heard him speak here before, read many of his articles, and what is so interesting to me about Rabbi Goldfeder is his principles go across every religious faith and every religious domination. He has written about and spoken on the rights, religious freedom for many, many different religious faiths. So with that said, we are glad and happy to welcome the next three individuals, and we hope that you will again have questions that you will present so that we can have a great discussion and conversation afterwards. Thank you.
Good evening, and assalamu alaikum. Boy, after sitting for more than an hour, standing up and moving felt so good. I highly recommend, and if those of you want to just stand up and shake it up a little bit, that's fine. I always love when I'm invited to a house of worship or a faith community invites me, but I especially like it when I'm invited to a Baptist community. As a Muslim, as a proud member of American Muslim community, I feel Baptists and Muslims have a lot in common. The main one is we have reputation problem. And I would love to see, I always love seeing those Baptist defensiveness. Or not all of us are like that. Or don't judge me based on some loud voices. And I just love it. That's my life. That's my community. And as you have heard, the panel of speakers tonight includes a lawyer, an accountant, and a priest, imam, and a rabbi. I'm not sure about the lawyer and the accountant, but the priest and the rabbi and myself will be walking into a bar immediately after this. You are welcome to come and join us. Religious freedom not only is a sacred, should be sacred and sanctified value, and in increasingly globalized society, increasingly diverse societies, religiously, ethnically, and otherwise, it should be the foundation of any society who's trying to understand and makes an attempt to understand and accommodate God's pluralistic creation of humanity in all ways, in all forms of diversity, but especially the religion. To me, this issue was incredibly sacred, and that was one of the main, if not the main reason, as a Turkish imam, as somebody who grew up in Turkey and lived in Middle East, in different parts of the Middle East, West Bank, Egypt, Jordan, and then spending 8 years in Southeast Asia, mostly in Myanmar, Burma, where these countries are not known with their religious freedom. I fell in love with the kind of, I remember the time I was reading the Federalist writings of the founding fathers of this nation, at the University of Pittsburgh Library, seeing the very early conversations about religious freedom, how religious freedom and the Anglo-Saxon understanding of secularism, which is very different than the other school of thought in the field of secularism, French secularism. I hope it will come out respectfully. This is nothing against the French culture and people, but these two different understandings of secularism created very different societies and countries. In French secularism, in that school of thought, secularism, the separation of church and state, also partially meant confining the religion to only religious spaces, confining the influence of religion into non-public spaces, or expression of religion, or I would say it bluntly, if you are secular in that sense, if you take it to the extreme, if you become so pious in that school of thought, you have to become somewhat certain level of anti-religion. You have to be hostile to religion. And growing up in Turkey, the founding fathers of Turkey learned the secularism from their French teachers. They took it to a whole different level. And I believe the Anglo-Saxon understanding of secularism, they also believed in absolute sanctity in the civic sense of separation of church and state, but at the same time, they wanted to create a society which is not hostile to religion, not seeing religion as innate, inherently problematic or negative. They wanted to create a civic society where religious communities and religion could be flourished. And I'm absolutely proud what this nation were able to not only think about this in the foundational documents, but also in 200 years how it sort of grow, how the seeds of that understanding, state will be secular, but the society will be religion-friendly, and religious communities will be flourishing, will be given an accommodation. Even the minority, even the people with very rare practices will be accommodated. As you have heard in the previous two speakers, the issues that our Supreme Court, our legislative branches, our executive branches have dealt in terms of religious liberties, it's really incredible, incredible. If you go and give a pen and paper to some communities around the world and say, imagine the best country or society in terms of religious freedom. Many of those people forget about changing their laws, changing their Supreme Court, changing their governmental institutions or civic society. They cannot even imagine, their horizon of imagination cannot even reach some of the things that we have already achieved in this part of the world and we have been discussing today. It's incredible how the Supreme Court spends weeks and months, how an entire Becket Foundation in favor of a small minority for their particular religious practice goes out of their way to defend their religious freedom. It's incredible. So we have to be incredibly grateful for what we have achieved in this society, how we kept the sanctity of religious freedom. But it wasn't easy. It was always challenged. So I believe, as much as I am grateful and proud as an American Muslim, still, despite all the challenges and flaws and areas of growth, we still are, I believe, one of the healthiest, one of the most successful attempts of understanding God's pluralistic creation with all the flaws and problems, and we have to preserve it and we have to improve it. In this culture of incredible polarization, I believe this religious freedom and the sanctity of it is facing enormous amount of challenges. Enormous amount of intellectual, civic, legal, and even spiritual challenges. There are forces of exclusion, forces of intolerance, forces of non-accommodation has been challenging and either trying to force our achievements to regress or stopping us, creating obstacle for us to even improve the kind of religious freedom that we hold sacred here. In my brief remaining time, I would like to outline these three major schools of thoughts, three voices of exclusion, three main streams of challenges and threats to religious freedom emerging in our society. And regretfully, as someone who's working on this issue day and night on a college campus, in all three areas, things will get a lot worse before it gets any better. All these areas are inviting us, those people who believe in religious freedom and hold it sacred, to work harder, or as hard as these people who are trying to further polarize us or undermine our religious freedom. The first school of thought, the first moment of obstacle for religious freedom is coming from an understandably camp of people who are anti-religious, who are absolutely a-religious, and towards, in many ways, they are the most expert French secular style. For many of those people who think religious people are very judgmental, narrow-minded, intolerant, you might want to check some of the secular versions of it. I came to this country because my wife wasn't able to go to university with hijab. It was a 99.9% Muslim country, but my wife wasn't allowed to enter a university campus. My wife only was able to get an education because we came to the United States, and for her to practice her religion was not only welcomed and accommodated, it was celebrated. It was seen as a diversity and richness. And I have a daughter. I came to this country because in my 99.9% Muslim Turkey, my daughter, if she chooses to wear hijab, if she chooses to practice Islam the way she likes, she wasn't going to be able to. So, and it was an incredible intolerance in the form of liberalism, secularism, in the form of modernism, etc. So there is one camp, not really the French secularism camp. It's not against the French people and French culture. By using, again, like Baptist and Muslim, by taking bad examples of religious intolerance, they end up sort of exceeding secular intolerance or anti-religious liberal intolerance. There's a rise in this camp that we have to not only go out of our way to, as faith communities, to say you have every right to not to practice any religion. Religious freedom also includes for people to be able to say, I don't believe in any religion. As someone who is so pained as a Muslim and ashamed and embarrassed, in so many of the countries where apostasy for people to leave religion or deny or reject any religion, unfortunately, is a crime by death and punishment, which is, in my understanding of Islam, not only not Islamic, but the violation of Islamic code of morals and ethics. If people want to be freed of any religion, if they would like to see no religion is being practiced, as long as they don't impose that view on another, they should be respected. But at the same time, this camp should not prevent obstacles or cause deterioration for those of us who would like to practice our religion faithfully in the way we feel comfortable. This is one camp, and I will spend least amount of it. The second camp, I would categorize them almost like an intra-family problem. In the second camp, there are voices and forces of exclusion, intolerance between liberal wings of every religion and more conservative wings of all religion. And pretty much everybody cries fall, but they end up doing the same fall into each other. I will never forget one of the biggest, earliest crises of interfaith problem or intrafaith problem at Duke University. When I first arrived as the imam and the Muslim chaplain of Duke University, a group of faithful disciples of Christ, little bit more conservative Christian students, they went and approached a group of Muslim students, and they respectfully wanted to invite them to their brand of Christianity, or they witnessed something that they feel so happy and proud. And a group of other Christians who heard this or who have seen this, that some Christian students are approaching to Muslim students with some flyers and message, they basically flipped out. They got so angry that these Muslim students were subject to horrific treatment or something like this. It was so painful to see how these people become holier than thou and more royal than the king. Muslims themselves didn't feel, and then these less conservative or less missionary ambitious Christian community went and filed an official complaint about this particular student organization. And they said they are evangelizing, they are trying to convert people, etc. And it was really funny. And immediately when I heard this, I took that 3 hijabi girl Muslim student, because they assured me that these students were very respectful. There was no manipulation, there was no deception. They were faithfully practicing their religion. And they saw a group of Muslim students, they very respectfully wanted to have a conversation. So I immediately went to the Dean of Student Conduct in defense of these students, their right to witness their religion proudly. And you should have seen this practicing Hindu dean looking at me, an imam with a 3 hijabi woman defending evangelizing Christians. It was worth seeing. He kept pinching himself to make sure this is not This is not dream. So whether we practice our religion a little bit more liberally, whether we do it a little bit more conservatively, as long as in the, again, Anglo-Saxon understanding of freedom of ideas and market space, if some religion, if some churches and synagogues and mosques, if they want to ordain gay clergy, if they want to ordain women, those who are practicing conservatively, a little bit more traditionally, they have every right to say this is wrong, as long as they don't impose this on them. And the liberal ones have every right to say this is right, and we will do this, and we will practice our religion. If you don't like that practice, go to other church, go to other mosque. I think I am being a little bit simplistic and half humorous in the context of, but this is really, there is a voice coming within an intra-faith, imposing one interpretation of religion onto another, and it's becoming increasingly, again, in the context of polarized America, creating challenges for us. And there are many worrying signs which will have implications of religious freedom. And the worst one is, unfortunately, the conservative, maybe I am on the little bit more traditional and conservative side of my own religion, maybe I am biased, so whatever I'm about to say, take it with a grain of salt. But I think in this context, the more conservative and more religious and traditional ones are, believe it or not, quite contrary to public perception, receiving the shorter end of the stick. Because all the interfaith, love, pluralism, inclusion calls end up silencing people who have a little bit more traditional views on their religion or demands to practice their religion. And these inclusion, love, pluralism celebrations, that's why this conversation and where it's happening is incredibly important. Our conversation for inclusion or our call for inclusion and diversity and pluralism should not, must not, ought not silence and exclude and unwelcome people who choose to practice their religion a little bit more conservatively, a little bit more traditionally, where they take certain things a little bit more seriously maybe, and it should include everybody. The third one, in the remaining 3.5 minutes, the third threat to I see, which is a very American reality, is coming from everybody. Either very religious people, liberally, like progressively religious people, or and anti-religious people. They are not totally and categorically against all religions. They are not against certain practices or interpretations of religions, but they are only against one religion. They somehow exceptionalize one religion or two religions. If you go to this broad spectrum of Americans and ask them, do you believe in religious freedom? It's amazing. The number is 90% in principle, conceptually, more than 90% of Americans, look at Gallup, Pew, and other places, conceptually, they believe in religious freedom, period. But when you ask them, but are you comfortable having a house of worship from this particular religion, which has been demonized, defamed, collectively went through sort of character assassination, then those numbers go into like 40% or 25%. And America has gone through this cycle of exceptionalizing one religion. America has gone through a cycle of limiting, confining, and violating the religious freedom of certain communities, mainly because of certain geopolitical events, etc. Like most of what's being said today about Islam and Muslims, and these anti-mosque campaigns, anti-Sharia campaigns, in Europe, mostly anti-hijab or burqa campaigns, etc. If you look, these people are not categorically rejecting all religions, but somehow they dehumanize or exceptionalize one particular religion. It was 150 years ago, it was Catholics, and in 1920s and 30s, it was the Jewish community, it was Mormon brothers and sisters, and now mostly Muslims and evangelical Christians. I'm just putting it lightly, that the arguments are the same. This is not a religion. We are not anti-religious. This is a political ideology. They have loyalty to somebody sitting in Rome, or there is some protocols of Zion organizing. This hate, sort of exceptionalizing one religion and imposing it to a community or society, saying these people are different. Therefore, we have to exceptionalize and not exercise our criteria or ethical moral standards, legal standards of religious freedom when it comes to this particular religion. I will end my favorite Turkish joke, Turkish redneck joke. In this case, I am arguing this camp is now attacking to certain communities, mostly Islam and Muslims. Don't get me wrong. There are evil people doing evil things in the name of Islam. There are terrorist organizations, look so Islamic, whatever that means, and doing horrific things, savagery, barbaric bloodshed in the name of Islam, beheading people, killing Christians, etc. But to generalize this and categorically think this is the most authentic form of Islam is an incredible injustice, unfairness, especially equating or associating overwhelming majority, 99.9% American Muslims, as if they have anything to do with them. And therefore bringing a cloud of suspicion and fear of these 4 to 6 million American Muslims who are by and large upright tax-paying citizens serving in army, university, hospital, etc. A lot of people, they tell me, oh, I never met a Muslim. Really? That means you have never been sick. 20%, 15 to 20% of, that means you've never been to a hospital. That means you're a horrible person, because even if you didn't get sick, you should be visiting somebody at the hospital. That means you're not a good Christian, good Jew, good Hindu, and good Buddhist. I say, like, all these brown people at the hospital who are saving lives, my wife is an ER nurse, they are Muslims in excessive numbers, because Muslims think there is a verse in the Quran, if you don't send your children to medical school, you will never see heaven. But here is the Turkish redneck joke. We saw this with the Catholics, and there are laws, as Hannah can tell you. What is it called? The Blaine Amendments, who were anti-Catholic laws in the late 19th century, which became a law, which it trickled down to the regular law of the United States. Unfortunately, now we are trying to undo them. But the Turkish redneck sees a huge, slippery banana peel on his walkway, like a huge, big banana peel on his walkway. You know what he says? He says, shoot, I'm going to fall again. Because he has done this many times. Because he stepped on these banana peels many times. Friends, brothers and sisters, religious freedom is sacred, and it's sacred for all of us. We often step on that banana peel and violated the religious freedom of many Catholics, and many Jews, and many Mormons and other ethnic communities, shameful in our society. But after 200 years, for God's sake, for everything that this country holds dear for, when we see a similar situation, we have to learn and say, this time I am not going to step on this. On the day where we should be remembering, feeling ashamed, and asking forgiveness to God, on the day, Holocaust Remembrance Day, where we sent some of the ships bringing Jews into the society so that they can experience religious freedom and live their Judaism beautifully, on that day, we committed mistakes, similar mistakes, and I believe violated the sanctity of religious freedom. I hope, as we did, our relative success in our recovery from anti-Catholic, anti-Irish, anti-Jewish, anti-Mormon sentiments, relatively, we are in a good position. We came a long way. That gives me a lot of hope that, once again, even though this voices of exclusion, voices of hate and bigotry, voices of un-American, let's violate and confine and tramp on the religious freedom of one particular religion, I believe these voices of exclusion, these voices of hate and bigotry, one more time, inshallah, be'ezrat Hashem, God willing, will be defeated by voices of inclusion, voices of welcome, and voices of grace and compassion, inshallah. Thank you very much.
Well, I think I'm not the first professor, but I'm the first law professor to speak. And one thing about law professors is they really like footnotes. Turns out that to publish a law review article, you have to have more footnotes than text. So I thought I would start with a couple of footnotes, and this may shorten my text later on, but I have to tell you, it was not, in reference to Mike Batt's presentation, it was not just that Johnson got this amendment passed because he didn't like the fact that nonprofit organizations had worked against him. There was another amendment that was quite important that had a similar background. It turns out that a very famous Baptist named John Leland, I think I got that right, was very significant in getting the First Amendment passed, getting some important Jefferson's bill on legislation on religious freedom passed. And one of the ways this was done is that, or as part of this process, an obscure individual named James Madison was endorsed by this Baptist pastor. So, you know, we wouldn't have the First Amendment but for some nonprofit organization endorsing a politician. So that's. Oh, maybe they were for profit then. They were taxed. Oh yeah, they weren't tax exempt. So I guess they were eligible. The other was as you know, I spent a lot of time outside the United States, and one of the things you often hear about in Europe is this problem because they've got a lot of Muslims moving in, and they really just don't know quite how to deal with this because they will say, we don't have a dialogue partner because these Muslims don't have a pope or a bishop and I often say, what's the problem? We have Baptists. Anyway, I think this is said in defense of the Muslims and the Baptists. I think society just has to get used to people being organized religiously in different ways. All right, well, I want to talk about the continuing need for vigilance for religious freedom. I think a lot of people, I've seen newspaper articles, people saying, what is all this pressure about religious freedom about? People can go to church on Sunday, they can do what they want, we don't have a lot of problems. And I think as you've already heard, there are some significant problems, and I think one of the things that we need to bear in mind is the importance of vigilance for this right. In his farewell address, President Andrew Jackson said, "You must remember, my fellow citizens, that eternal vigilance by the people is the price of liberty, and that you must pay the price if you wish to secure this blessing." Similarly, this figure endorsed by John Leland, James Madison, said, "We should take alarm at the first experiment on our liberties. We hold this prudent jealousy to be the first duty of citizens and one of the noblest characteristics of the late Revolution." I like that phrase, a prudent jealousy. We should be wise, but we should be careful and not let this be put at risk. And I have to say, most of what I say will be talking about the U.S. situation, but in some ways, as problematic as some of our challenges are, we should be grateful for our problems because they are so minor by comparison to what is being seen in many other parts of the world. A few years ago, the Pew Forum on Religion and Public Life did a study that showed that 32% of the countries on earth have high or very high restrictions on religious freedom. And since that includes some very large countries like China and India and some others, as high that something like 70% of the world's population lives in countries with high or very high restrictions. Now, the next chart uses the same color scheme, and the red at the top shows that these are the high and very high percentage of countries, And that's been steadily increasing, little minor adjustment in the last year, but basically the pattern is getting worse, and the same is true with respect to the percentage of the world's population. Now, this next chart, unfortunately, doesn't quite work the way I would want it to. I'm sure I can't see it from here, so I'm sure you can't. But I want to point attention to two circles that you can see and then one that you can't. The two circles that you can see are the big ones. The one that's toward the top is India, and the one that's sort of low and toward the side is China. This is because this graph maps high social restrictions on the vertical axis and high governmental restrictions on the horizontal axis. And it turns out that China has very high government restrictions, but not too many social problems. Whereas India is a sort of more moderate with respect to its government restrictions, but it has a lot of social problems. Now, the circle you can't see is sort of diagonally up. It's a fairly large circle, sort of pale, but it's the United States. And we're about, in terms of social problems, actually a little higher than China, but much lower than India. And the next thing shows that we've actually been getting worse. So I thought I would be able to point at things, but the screens are sort of on the wrong side of me. So, you'll get the idea. Now, it's interesting that this is happening. That is, these high restrictions. This is at a time when we know, on the basis of empirical research, that there are very high correlations between religious freedom and all kinds of other social goods. It's very clear that, logically, that there are tight connections between religious freedom and other kinds of political freedoms, freedom of the press, civil liberties, and so forth. But there are a lot of other social goods that are aligned with religious freedom. Gender empowerment, the longevity of democracy in countries, lower levels of armed conflict, lower poverty levels, higher percentages of GDP, gross domestic product, spent on health care, more foreign direct investment, higher earned income for women and even for men. So there are a lot of social goods, and yet we're seeing these patterns of increasing restrictions on religious freedom. Some of the latest empirical research shows that worldwide, restrictions on religious freedom are highly correlated with and appear to be causally significant factors in much of the violence we are seeing that's associated with religion. It's not so much that the religious groups are somehow inherently violent, but religion is tremendously valuable to people. And when people feel pushed in a corner and threatened about this key part of their personality, they will often act defensively, and this leads to violence. There are other sources of violence, obviously. We don't want to understate or underestimate those. We have to be realistic. And security problems are one of the major things one has to think about. But one of the problems is there's a tendency to over-securitize, with the result that the security efforts become counterproductive. The restrictions emanating from security that restrict religious freedom end up undermining the intended security protections. Now, I know you can't read this. I can't also read this. This is a little bit of advertising. We do, as part of our effort to help people be vigilant, we do a daily or almost daily project that just sort of aggregates newspaper headlines from around the world in three basic areas: international, European, and the United States. And the small print is to give you an idea of just how many of these things come up every day. My wife says it's overwhelming. You can't look at all of them. And the good news is you don't have to. But if you're interested, you can track this. I know the State Department, the Ambassador at Large for Religious Freedom has told me he requires his staff to read them. I don't even require my staff to read them all. But it's a good way of being vigilant, being aware of what's happening. And you can look at go back and look at things. If I'm going to a country, I'll often just go and read over what's been happening lately in the country. Let me just give you an example from today's headlines, drawn from this, and it gives you an idea of some of the things that we're facing, and I can tell you virtually any day you could find things like this. Now, we were told not to say anything about refugees, and I have to confess, I have to say a few things because I had really planned to say some things about that even before the past week. But it was interesting today, CNN reported that 138 years ago, the controversy over travel bans and religion was about Mormons migrating from Europe. The presidents were trying to get Europeans to restrict Mormons from invading the country. Now, here's another headline: is religious liberty back at the Georgia legislature? I think what that means is there's another round of pro-religious liberty legislation, and unfortunately, too often these days, that is being mischaracterized as anti-gay or anti-LGBT legislation, which is certainly not intended, but that's been making it controversial in many of our state legislatures. The Christian Science Monitor had an interesting article today on why Trump's refugee policy divides religious leaders. If you get these headlines, you can just go click on them, and if they look interesting, you can read the full article, but you can imagine what's at stake here. There's some notion that on the one hand, we want to sort of protect religious values, but on the other hand, it seems problematic in a country so committed to religious freedom to be guiding policy by what sounds like a pretty exclusive or biased policy. Here's another one, state religious freedom updates. It's a handy link to find out what's going on in state religious liberty initiatives. A state RFRA piece of legislation was defeated in Wyoming, in Colorado, withdrawn in Wyoming, passed committee in Virginia, and slightly different topic in Kentucky. They're authorizing some social studies Bible classes, which has been allowed in the past by the Supreme Court. Mexican bishops respond to Trump's border wall. You can imagine they were not endorsing the wall. And let's see, the executive order referring to the immigration order, refugees, national security, and a biblical worldview. I'm not sure which way that one comes out, but anyway, interesting headline. And then, of course, some of you may have your cell phones turned on and know who the Supreme Court nominee is by now. I'm sorry, I can't report. I just know the rumors are Gorsuch. Okay. Well, I want to just touch on two or three things quickly. In this kind of setting, it's impossible to go into detail. But first, shifting patterns in anti-discrimination law. We're all conscious of the Supreme Court's decision in the same-sex marriage field. It's interesting, our center did an amicus brief looking at the sort of international dimensions of what's going on in this area, and it would perhaps interest you to know that there are just over 20 countries out of the 200 some odd worldwide that have approved same-sex marriage. There are much larger numbers that have official partnerships, other kinds of things, but only 20 have changed the notion of marriage per se. And of those, only 2, the United States and Brazil, have done this by judicial mandate. 2 others, South Africa and Colombia, strongly suggested to the legislature that they should revise the legislation, but they left it the legislative branch. But basically, this complex issue has been left in most countries to legislative resolution. One of the interesting things about the key decision, the Obergefell decision in this area, is that while it's been criticized for many reasons, just the reasoning of the court, it's interesting that among the lower court decisions, one kind of reason that had been given was that really the prior traditional marriage laws were just based on bigotry, or since they were religious, they were inherently irrational. And one of the significant things is that the Supreme Court clearly did not predicate its decisions on those kinds of things. I mean, they're left open the possibility that we should have reasoned discourse about these issues. Now, as has been mentioned, we can expect a lot of possible impacts coming out of these decisions. We don't know what all the impacts will be. There are worries about the tax-exempt status of religious and religiously affiliated institutions. I'm personally sort of skeptical that those efforts are going to go very far very soon, but there are certainly rumblings. There are worries about the accreditation of religious and religiously affiliated institutions. We've had cases of, say, marriage counselors or a marriage counselor in a program to prepare to be a marriage counselor being thrown out of her program because she was unwilling to counsel gay couples, and she was ultimately, by judicial decree, told that they shouldn't discriminate on that basis. There are other kinds of licensing programs. We've talked about some of the pharmacy cases, closely held and nonprofit organizations with conscientious objections. Again, Hannah Smith has talked at length about those. Job discrimination because of expressing religiously based views, favoring traditional marriage on or off the job. So there are just a number of things that are happening. One of my concerns is there is a rush to be, we've really been converted as a country, and I think rightly so, not to engage in discrimination, to respect people's dignity. But there's an increasing tendency to think that in the rush to protect new areas of non-discrimination, we can forget about some of the old ones. And I think it's important that we remember that religious discrimination and not discriminating on the basis of religion is one of the earliest of them all. School settings, a number of sensitive issues here. The ability of religious parents to influence how their children in public schools are taught about sensitive sexual matters. Loss of accreditation for schools with faith-based honor codes requiring chastity and fidelity. Inappropriate constraints on pupils writing or talking about religious experiences. Heard about the story of a young child, 8 or 9 years old, and they were having a class experience on writing about things that were important to them in their life, and she wanted to write about her baptism. It was a tradition that had older, not infant baptism, and her teacher said, "You can't turn that in, you have to write on something else." Well, there's no reason constitutionally that she has to do that. It's just sort of an extreme understanding of separation of religion and the state. One of the things that I thought was, there was a story going around some years ago about a textbook that was being, had talked about the pilgrims by indicating that they were travelers in a foreign land, didn't want to mention that they had some religious concerns motivating their travel. I think we see some of these things. I think it's got to be possible to acknowledge the place of religion in society in ways that don't impose religion on other people. We've talked a little bit about the autonomy of religious institutions. It's clear that religious organizations should be autonomous in defining what their own religious beliefs are, resolving their own internal disputes. But we've seen a number of issues, and fortunately the Supreme Court decided the Hosanna-Tabor case in a way that re-emphasized the right of religious organizations to select their own employees and require them to abide by the teachings of the community. Well, refugee settings, this has become a controversial one, and not only just this week. We're seeing globally a refugee crisis of proportions that has never been seen before. There's something like 60 million refugees right now. I met earlier this fall with the deputy head of the UN Commission on Refugees. She has said she had been working in Turkey, where in 2010 they were absolutely overwhelmed because they had about 20,000 refugees. 3 or 4 years later, they had 3 million. And we've all been reading about just the scope of these problems. Now, one of the realities in these settings is that as people move, as people go through these kinds of crisis times in their lives, they may reconsider, they may be converted to a new religion. There are questions about what is permissible for faith-based groups to do in talking to people in this crisis kind of situation. I think there are strong views that religious groups should not sort of abuse their position when people are in such vulnerable positions. But it's problematic that we're seeing a lot of skepticism on the part of those who process refugees saying, oh, we don't really believe these conversions. We don't really believe that they're suddenly now Christians and it's going to be life-threatening for them to return to a country for which conversion out of Islam could be problematic. These are kinds of practical problems. We'll see over the next days how the Trump administration and the courts sort out the executive decree that's dealing with some of these things. My point is, I think these things need to be dealt with in ways that are sensitive, that finding sensitive solutions depends on people with knowledge from different religious communities, talking with each other, getting the best ideas, and finding solutions that are sensitive and that will work. And these are problems that every community is going to face. There are 67,000 municipalities in this country. There are problems or issues in every country, in every city. Every city needs to think hard and sensitively about these issues, and it's vital for people like you to be able to come together and have input on these trends. I think I'm out of time, so I won't talk about the Utah compromise on the LGBT issue, which was interesting. Utah is well known as one of the more conservative states in the country, only place where Clinton came in third, and I don't mean Hillary. But religious leaders working together with the legislature came up with a legislative solution to discrimination problems that was probably more protective of the LGBT community than legislation that's been passed in the blue states, but it had very broad protections for religious liberty concerns as well. And that's at least an evidence that we can find ways that can be fair for all and can work for everyone. So in conclusion, what are some of the things that can be done? We can study the issues and share information as we're doing tonight. People can learn to speak with courage for their own convictions, but with civility. To get involved in the political process, in local political process, school boards, land use settings. Work on issues with people of other faiths. Volunteer for charitable work. Get involved in education, school settings. Be part of a club, business group, or professional association, and enlarge our voices through social media. I think in this kind of community I can also say, pray. We need to have help with these problems. But what we really need to find as a result of all this is sensitive solutions, solutions that are longer than a Twitter feed, longer than a soundbite, but will help us all live together. We need to be vigilant. Thank you.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I want to just start by thanking our wonderful hosts and especially our organizer, Kayleen Stroud, for putting together this event. The topic I was asked to speak about was, are there any suggestions on how all people of faith can be involved in protecting and strengthening religious freedom in their communities? And in addition, if possible, to talk a little bit about protecting faith organizations' ability to apply their own moral standards in practice. And when I do these events, I sometimes wear two hats. I'm sometimes asked to speak as a rabbi or as a Jewish educator, and sometimes as a practicing attorney or a legal academic. But tonight you heard from a better attorney, a better member of the clergy, and a better law professor. So I'm going to try to wear multiple hats, if only to stand out, but also because I do actually believe that no one approach is enough. And if we want to protect religious liberty, you need both clergy and counsel. But I do think that there's one element that's common to everything we just mentioned. It's common to both strengthening religious freedom generally, it's common to protecting faith organizations specifically, it's common to what educators need to do, and it's common to what lawyers need to do. And that one common element is, in fact, commonality. If we want to strengthen religious freedom broadly, if we want to strengthen and protect faith-based communication and organization specifically, if we want to more effectively educate our congregants and litigate for our clients, then we need to begin by finding common ground and common language. I think there are 4 important steps to this process, and no matter who you are and what community you're a part of, I think that we should all be participating in one or more of these steps. The first one involves public education and giving our students the tools to find common ground. Judaism is a text-based religion, and so if you'll indulge me, I'll share with you a few texts along the way. The first comes from Ethics of the Fathers, chapter 2, Mishnah 7. Marbe yeshiva, marbe chachma. If you increase education, you increase wisdom. Aha, you might ask, but what exactly is wisdom? If we can get the next slide. There you go. Ezehu chacham, who is the wise man? Halomed mikol adam. Someone who learns from all men. Note, it doesn't say who learns from all Jewish people. This is much broader than that. You see, a diverse religious education is perhaps the best way to protect religious freedom long term. If every child understands what religion is and what religion can be, then when they grow up and become congressmen and congresswomen and they're asked to protect religious liberty, they will understand that they're being asked to protect a system of values that many hold dear. They'll understand that it's not a favor they're being asked to do. They're being asked to protect a fundamental right. And again, let's be specific. I don't mean that we need to have Catholics in Catholic school learning canon law and Jews in yeshiva learning Torah. That's also important, but that's religious study, and that's separate, and that's private. What we need everyone to do, public and private schools alike, is to learn about religion and about all religions and about other non-religious value systems and about what each of them separately and individually brings to the table. And we need to cover all religions and all systems because much of the phobia and the fear and the hostility that various religions face today is because children grow up thinking of those religions as the other instead of as the brother of their own faith. And yet, there is hope because there is actually empirical evidence that if we do a better job of this, we can create a more tolerant society, a society where religious values are understood across the spectrum and where people of all religions and no religion alike feel comfortable talking about and sticking up for each other. Get the next slide. The First Amendment Center in May 2006 released the results of a comprehensive study that was designed to see if this was true, if teaching about diverse religions had any impact on students' religious tolerance, and it did. Overwhelmingly, they found that students had become more tolerant of other religions, more willing to protect the rights of people of other faiths, even more empowered to fight back against faith-based bullying. As one student noted, I didn't know anything about any religion other than mine, but by the end of the semester in this course, we were all much more accepting toward one another. You realize that we're not all that different at all. Former Chief Rabbi Jonathan Sachs once famously said that religion remains the most powerful community builder that the world has known. And the building blocks of our community can and should be tolerance and commonality. And those blocks should be mixed in with the other blocks that children play with at a young age. The second step is religious education for adults, and that's where the clergy come in. It's important for every faith community to realize that despite all of their complexities and diversities, religions have a lot in common. You know, last July, Imam Musri and I were in Utah for a BYU conference, and I remember the sun was starting to set, and I realized it was time for mincha, the afternoon prayer. So I pulled out my cell phone to pull up my prayer app to try and see exactly what time the sun would be setting. And I turn around, and there was the imam pulling out his cell phone and checking his app. And it was such a special, funny moment to me. It was such an honest, human moment. And life is full of those simple moments of simple connection. And when we teach about religions in our community, we need to talk about solidarity, not only with those in our religion, but with those in other religions and with those who are not part of any religion, because when we see each other as part of this broader family, then we'll feel the need to stand up for each other when they need us. Pastor Youth, in his opening remarks, talked about the golden rule. Hillel the Elder, one of the most famous, important figures in Jewish history, is famous for many things, in particular, two quotes. When he was asked to sum up all of Jewish law in one sentence, you can get the slide, he used a slightly different version of the rule of reciprocity. He said, "Da'alach saneh lechavrech lo sa'avid." That which you would find hateful, do not do to your friend. And that rule can and should be read in conjunction with his other most famous statement, if we can get the slide. Im ein ani li mili. If I'm not for myself, who will be for me? Uchshani la'atzmi ma'ani. But if I'm only for myself, who am I? Vimlo achshav emasai, and if not now, then when? And so when we teach our congregants about the importance of religion, one of the values we need to teach is the value of commonality. Be proud of your own heritage, because if you're not, who will be? But if you see another group being persecuted or hated, stop and speak out, because if you are only for yourself, then what are you? So the first two pillars for protecting religious freedom are educating our children to understand religion and understand the other, and educating our congregations to stand up for the other, because we're all in this together. The third principle is at the intersection of where law meets religion and religion meets law. If I can get a slide. And again, I can't and I won't speak for other religious traditions, but I can tell you that in Judaism, compromise is considered to be an ultimate value. The power of compromise, Yafeh koach pshara mikoach din. The power of compromise is in fact stronger than the power of justice. And that plays itself out in many ways. Theologically, Jews believe that dina de malchuta dina, the law of the land is the law. And so the law of the state that we live in becomes imbued with a halachic Jewish law significance in and of itself. And so as much as possible, we compromise. We graft our system onto the majority system to make sure that we reduce conflict when conflict can be reduced. That doesn't work for every situation. It doesn't work for every religious tradition. But to the extent possible, I would suggest that that approach be explored. Judaism, for instance, grew up as a religion in a place, in a society where it was always the minority. And so it's quite comfortable functioning in society where it has values that are separate and distinct from the majority culture. Some other faiths, this can be quite jarring, and it's been a difficult experience over the last several decades watching the majority system move away from faith tradition. But we can separate the idea of protecting religious practice from the idea of shaping secular culture, because those are in fact two distinct ideas. And while it might be important and we can work towards having religion shape the culture, we should only fight to protect religious practice. And those are two separate and distinct ideas, and it's important to remember. And the concept of compromise comes into play for the attorney as well. I believe, again, that to the extent possible, we should minimize conflict and compromise where we can. For example, a concrete example, we spoke about it a little bit last year at the same conference, when the baker doesn't want to bake a cake for the wedding of a couple whose lifestyle is at odds with his or her sincerely held religious belief. I think there's room for compromise on both sides. Whether the compromise is setting up a statewide cake distribution system so that when people, for real, when people order a cake, their order gets fulfilled, but there's no one particular baker who's tied to a particular order. Or maybe the compromise is that over-the-counter sales are treated differently than cakes or flowers in a particular design that requires artistic expression, or any of the other myriad suggestions that are out there. To the extent that we can find room to compromise and to stop fighting about religion specifically, we can and we should, because when we don't, when it becomes an all or nothing zero-sum game, we play into that false narrative that the religious worldview is somehow incompatible with other worldviews, and it's not. There might be narrow points of tension and conflict that we need to work out, but for the most part, we recognize that in any given society, there are multiple values that operate in dialectic tension, religious, not religious, all of them worth treating with respect. If we can find enough common ground to compromise, we can move society forward. We can build bridges instead of fighting battles. Now, one important caveat, sometimes you do have to go to court. Just last week, I was proud to argue a case called Smith versus Owens in the 11th Circuit in Atlanta, representing an Islamic prisoner who wanted to grow a beard in prison, and quoting from our new Supreme Court nominee Neil Gorsuch's opinion in Yellow Bear, a case about a Native American prisoner. But I think that in general, to the extent possible, we should think of any court as a court of last resort. And the fourth principle, I think, is really just another formulation of a very classic idea in law and religion. Under Supreme Court precedent, in order to be valid, legislation needs to have a secular purpose. And when you take a step back and think about it more broadly, when you think about the idea of protecting religion on the broadest scale, the concept of using secular terms makes a lot of sense. If you want to explain to someone who doesn't share your worldview, why they need to protect religion, you can't use a circular definition. You can't say you need to protect religion because religion is important. You need to use terms that are common to both parties, and secular terms and values are, in fact, our common language. And so the question is, are we able to use secular terms to describe the importance of religion? And I believe the answer is yes, and that is the answer for how we can protect faith-based institutions. In a typical case, take the Little Sisters case, for instance, what happens is an organization contends that in order to comply with their understanding of their religious belief, they'll need an accommodation or they'll be forced to shut down. Now, a court might say, so what? Shut down. And you can respond and say, no, religion is important, and that will lead to a protracted battle, and with people like Hannah on our side, we'll probably win that battle. But the better answer might be to avoid the conflict in the first place and to find commonality early enough. And that's why the secular answer becomes so important. The reason we need to protect faith-based organizations has nothing to do with religion. Is because closing these organizations would be devastating not only for a religion, but for American civic life. And it's the job of the attorney to urge the court to consider those secular impacts. If we can get the slide. Religion is demonstrably good. Robert Putnam has pointed out, studies have shown time and again that involvement in religious organizations and involvement in religious networks are by far the greatest predictors of philanthropic generosity and civic involvement. Again, this is not to say that all religious people are one way, all non-religious people are another way, but empirical research shows that religious Americans are generally more altruistic neighbors and more conscientious citizens than their secular counterparts. If you hold constant for all other demographic factors, demographic predictors of volunteering, including gender, education, income, race, region, homeownership, length of residence, marital, parental status, ideology, age, etc., the findings are remarkable. You can get the next slide. Over 1/3 of all volunteering in the United States is done for religious organizations, but more importantly, of all people who volunteered for a religious group, over 90% also volunteered for at least one secular group, which makes them 2 to 3 more times likely to volunteer for a secular group than people who don't volunteer for a religious group. Compared to typical once-a-year churchgoer, the average weekly churchgoer volunteers an extra 10.5 hours a month for religious causes and an extra 6.4 hours more for secular causes. And this difference is especially marked for service to poor, elderly, and young people. You can get the slide. In terms of charitable giving, the findings are even clearer. Giving to religious charities is strongly positively correlated to giving to secular charities and organizations. If you measure charitable giving as a fraction of annual income, the average person in the most religious fifth is more than 4 times as generous as his or her counterpart in the most secular fifth. And religion also inculcates a commitment to civic involvement. Can you get the slide? Religious Americans are up to twice as active civically as secular Americans. Religiosity is by far the strongest and most consistent predictor of a wide range of measures of civic involvement, including belonging to community organizations. Now again, so far, all that information alone doesn't necessarily protect our faith-based organizations, but get the next slide. This should. With comprehensive demographic and ideological controls, it turns out that actual religiosity and religious beliefs themselves are entirely insignificant as a predictor for all of these measures of good neighborliness. In every case, what matters is the religious network and organization. Statistics even suggest that an atheist who happens to become involved in a religious network is more likely to volunteer at a secular soup kitchen than a devout believer who's not part of a religious social network or organization. So to non-believers who have come here tonight, welcome to the club. And the effect, by the way, if you can get the slide, also seems to be causal. By examining how respondents changed over time, the surveys found that controlling for all other factors, people who became more closely involved with religious networks over time became better citizens and more generous neighbors, while those whose involvement dropped became less so. So religious networks are about people working together for a common cause, and religious organizations tend to lead people to focus outward and not inward. Now, we've long thought of religious charities and religious networks as playing a critical role in filling the gap in the social welfare net. You know, they feed the needy, they clothe the poor, they care for the widow and the orphan. But it turns out empirically that the impact of religious organizations is much more broad. The reason, get the next slide, oh, it's the last slide, I think. The reason we need to protect religious organizations is not because of religion, it's because of all the quantifiable secular benefits and goods that religious organizations bring. And so if we want to protect religious freedom broadly, if we want to protect religious faith-based organizations, we need to focus on commonality. We need to teach our children about all the values that we share, so they don't grow up only thinking about the ways in which we differ. We need to remind our congregants to find commonality in the experiences of others, so that they stand up when others are knocked down. To the extent possible, we need to find common ground religiously and legally. We need to narrow disputes to specific contextual issues and cases and work together on practical solutions instead of letting false perceptions drive us even farther apart. And we need to find common language to explain to those who do not share our beliefs why those beliefs are still indeed special and worth protecting. Again, we could win in court with people like Hannah and the Beckett Fund, but I think that if we have to go to court, in some sense, we've already lost. I'll end by quoting the famous litigator David Boies. Embrace a diversity of ideas. Embrace the fact that you can disagree with people and not be disagreeable. Embrace the fact that you can find common ground. If you disagree on 9 out of 10 things, but you can find common ground on that 10th, maybe you can make progress. And if you can find common ground, you can accomplish great things. With blessings that we can accomplish great things together. Thanks.
Okay, three things very quickly. First of all, it's 9 o'clock, or maybe a little after, and we know that some of you have to go. We release you and set you free with thanks for you being here, but if you can stay, there's some great questions, and we want to get to those. Secondly, Kayleen Stroud. Where's Kayleen? Where's Kayleen? There she is. Kayleen Stroud is the chair, and she had a great committee working with her, but she's the reason this happened from the LDS. Thank you, Kayleen. So thank you very much. And third, the panel is gathering. Will the panel all come up? Thank you. Sorry, I was supposed to say that first. Maybe that was the first thing. But the panel's coming up, and as they're seated, we have and as those who need to go, we bless you on your way, but those who can stay, we've got some great questions for a few minutes. We'll take a little time, And we'll ask the panel to just have a seat and to be comfortable, but to be also to have an economy of words as you answer, so that we can get as much in as possible in the few minutes we have left that we'll take. So with that, we'll go with the first question.
In a pluralistic society, the only way that the state can truly represent everyone is to be neutral. Do you agree or disagree?
I religiously agree. If that means neutrality means also not creating obstacles, if that neutrality means also respecting religion and allowing religions and even empowering and supporting religion in civic spaces, non-governmental spaces, to flourish, I religiously agree. I find that form of secularism sacred.
I would just
It's on.
I would just say neutrality can mean a lot of different things. I think neutrality that creates a framework in which different religious communities can live together, that is really healthy and good. If neutrality means everyone needs to meet a certain secular style or something like that, and is coerced into some narrower frame, that's an unhealthy neutrality, and we should strive to have the healthy neutrality.
Okay, this question is in regard to the 1954 Johnson Act. Is there a danger if churches are permitted to be political lobbyists, quote unquote, that the majority religions will have a louder voice at the expense of the minority religions?
Well, since I spoke on that topic, I'll address it at least first. I think the whole idea behind allowing free communications by churches is to simply allow them to exercise the rights that are enumerated in the First Amendment, regardless of what religious faith they belong to. So, we live in a country where the majority determines a lot of things by votes, but we have laws that protect the minorities, and I think that should continue to be the case. But we certainly believe that that religious groups as well as charitable groups should have the freedom to say whatever they believe they're called to say, and without fear of reprisal by the government.
I would just add, it's conceivable that the situation might be different in a situation where you had a country where one religion had, say, 80% of the population, something like that. In the United States, we are all minorities. The largest group is the Catholics. They have about 25%. So long as we have a fairly broad distribution, I think a policy that makes it fairly easy for everyone to speak is going to be fairly safe.
Okay, many Christians would like prayer in public schools. What is the opinion from our experts? Is this an issue of the separation of church and state?
Go ahead. This is the non-Christian side of the aisle, so. No, go ahead, please.
I think the question becomes, whose prayer? And you can say, well, Christian prayer. I don't know how many different denominations of Christianity are represented here tonight, but it becomes a very, very intense practical question and kind of opens up a can of worms that might not be worth opening. Now, on the flip side, a generic neutral prayer has been argued for, but again, I'll just put out there that even a generic neutral prayer assumes many, many things. Even to the word God. Well, maybe we can all agree on God, but there are people who can't agree on God or agree on a singular God. And so, as a matter of practicality, I think it's a nice thing to talk about, but very hard to implement.
I guess I have a slightly different take on that. And I believe many of the great ideas and initiatives which could bring a lot of growth, progress, is defeated because it's potential risk. And often it's given up without even trying. Or often the bad examples, unfortunately, creates a consequence for any potential good example. If there are some crazy Muslims, crazy Jews, crazy Christians abusing a prayer and imposing religion in such a disrespectful way, unfortunately, that closes the door for an ability for a society to reflect and create an opportunity where a Christian, Jew, or a Muslim faithfully witness and present authentically Jewish, Islamically permissible, halachically Christian prayer. I don't know where is that lack of self-confidence coming from. I think if it is done respectfully, if it is done in a civil, which most American civic places, if it is done with a good intention that nobody's imposing anything on you, if your religion is threatened by somebody's prayer, you shouldn't be in that religion in the first place. If it's that weak that somehow your Muslimness will be threatened by somebody praying in front of you in the name of Jesus, maybe you should consider your own connection. That I think our religious commitments and civic commitments should be strong enough to allow somebody to witness his or her religion in the most authentic form that he or she feels comfortable with.
Great answer.
A quick response. I just want to say I love prayer, and I pray every morning and afternoon and evening. But I want to put a face on the issue, because this is what really helped me come to terms with it. I agree with you in principle, and I'm not opposed to having a moment of silence or meditation, which can be used individually for prayer. But McCollum versus Maryland is one of the cases that's often labeled as driving God out of school. But it wasn't about taking God out of school. It was about a little boy, a real little boy named Jack McCollum, who was made to stand in the hallway while his classmates prayed, and was made to feel like an outsider. And it's important when you look at the pictures of that little boy, who then had to go to court, where his teachers testify that it wasn't about religion, it's because he was weird, and in front of the country was made a national mockery. When you put a face on that one person, it becomes, in my opinion, less about the tyranny of the minority and more about making sure that the outsider feels protected. And that's what I think is an important way to think about it.
This can be a Jewish-Muslim conversation. I absolutely agree, but those bad examples should not deter us for our religious entrepreneurship and civic entrepreneurship to try and create those educational opportunities when a Christian can pray in the name of Jesus, and those who are not part of that tradition will faithfully can witness and respectfully just observe.
That's good discussion. Thank you both. Along similar lines, but a different category, we had 4 or 5 questions that hit this same theme. I may read 2 or 3 of them just to kind of make sure I cover the theme. Do atheists have the same freedom to speak about their atheism? Do seculars have a place at the table of our society? Is atheism a religion under the law, and should it be given the same legal protections as faith-based traditions?
And I'm very conscious of international settings, and at this point the standard lingo internationally is we have freedom of religion or belief. And the or belief is the rights of people who are not necessarily imbued with religious beliefs as such. And I think it's very important that we be able to recognize and protect people, whatever their core belief structure is. There are a whole set of questions there, but I think it comes down to really recognizing and respecting people's dignity, which is often connected with their core beliefs.
As it would relate to the topic that I addressed, we've just begun what is referred to as the 115th Congress. Every 2 years we have a new Congress. And for the last several Congresses, legislation has been introduced that would modify the Johnson Amendment, but only as it would relate to churches and houses of worship, to give those organizations the freedom to speak about political matters should they choose to do so. That legislation has never gotten traction. When the commission that I referred to earlier addressed the issue, the commission felt strongly that members of the clergy should have that freedom if they choose to utilize it. But they also felt that if that freedom were granted to religious organizations, it should also be granted to non-religious nonprofit organizations, be they atheist or just secular in general, because it was a matter of fairness and equity. And I think it's interesting that in light of that recommendation, we now see legislation being introduced, both houses of Congress, that has traction probably for the first time. So I do think that we have to think about equity and fairness for people who don't have a religion whenever we think about an issue that impacts religion as well.
I presented, I hope it came across very clearly, three-head monster attacking and threatening our religious freedom. So the first head of that monster was secular, atheist, fundamentalism, and radicalism, hostile towards religion, and similarly, the others, they are almost the same. The other side of the coin, religious intolerance, non-accommodation, and fundamentalism towards the secular people and the atheist people. It seems the religious communities have to develop a theology, a strong theology, maybe 11th commandment. Thou shalt have freedom, or thou shalt choose to not believe, etc. It's a verse in the Quran, actually, La ikraha fid din. There is no coercion in religion. But we have to crystallize it in the 21st century. We have to develop religious values in respecting people's ability or freedom not to practice anything. But it also goes both ways. That the a-religious atheist people, they have to develop, they don't have a theology, maybe. They may be more religious than they think they are, but that's a different conversation. But they have to develop an incredibly important discourse, civic discourse, that their atheism, their secularity or secularism in any form or shape that they feel comfortable is not being anti-religion or not trying to undermine religion. It goes both ways.
Yes.
Yes.
But again, to the Imam's point, along with recognition comes rights and responsibilities, and I think it's also a two-sided coin, so yes.
This one's probably for you, Mr. Batts. Can a church or nonprofit organization forego its tax exemption and then speak in ways that would be violation of the Johnson Amendment?
Well, the answer to that would be yes, but under current practice, it's been demonstrated quite clearly that you can violate the Johnson Amendment and not give up your tax exemption because the IRS doesn't enforce the Johnson Amendment. There's a fundamental reason that groups like Alliance Defending Freedom and the Pulpit Freedom Sunday Initiative have been happening over the last several years with a sort of in-your-face approach with the IRS, and there's been no adverse action, and that is that the IRS absolutely does not want to have that constitutional litigation. But to technically answer your question, absolutely. A church doesn't have to operate with tax exemptions should it choose not to in our society.
The footnote is 501c4. 501c3 is the exemption that you have to, and 501c4 is organizations that are perfectly free to speak out and endorse candidates and so forth.
Okay, these are, again, several questions related to the same topic. I'm going to read two or three of them to try to make sure we get the gist. What right is violated to a religious person by marriage equality? How is the same-sex issue religious freedom? Is it not rather relational and sexual? Discuss the Boy Scout transsexual newsstands and any problems with the LDS Church dropping the scouting program. And how is declining service to people who believe in homosexuality different than declining service to these who are Jewish, black, etc., and once permissible on religious basis?
I'll start. There are quite a few there.
Let the Mormons start.
I'll take the
Boy Scout
actually the
LDS?
Boy Scouts. The Mormon Church has not dropped the Boy Scouts. One of the difficulties with the whole issue of how the Boy Scouts should deal with the gay issue is that our denomination, the Catholics, and I'm sure several Protestant denominations, I guess I'm not sure, but we've been in many ways the backbone of the Boy Scouts movement. And one of the reasons for that is that it's a very good way to help reinforce and teach moral and spiritual values. And when these are suddenly different, it makes it harder to sort of have the institutional alignments. At this point, there is the Boy Scouts movement has taken the decision to broaden the membership rules and so forth. without necessarily requiring every institution that is supporting the Boy Scouts to do the same thing. How are people's rights violated? In a way, people's rights aren't violated by same-sex marriage. What the problems arise in complicity situations where you are feeling that the other side is coercing you to accept their values. I think one of the things that the Utah Compromise demonstrated is there are very good ways that people can live together, respectfully recognizing different lifestyles, different ways of living, so long as one's own, the religious side is free to believe its lifestyle and its direction. There are ways that this can be done. I think one of the things that's happening is that people are realizing there's been a lot of fear, a lot of polarization, and one of the things we need to do is find ways to reduce the fear, reduce the polarization without requiring sameness. In a pluralistic society, we can find sensitive ways that we can live together with fairness for all.
My strongest reaction is the two questions. What religious right is being violated if somebody's same-sex marriage is denied? Or what is religious about being gay or lesbian, and etc.? Quite honestly, I take some offense as a religious person. If we believe religion is only certain do's and do nots, if religion is only certain laws, if you don't necessarily see religion as a way of life which encompasses and envelopes every aspect of our life, which is most religious people see in that fashion, it's so unfair, even if you are against homosexuality or pro, it doesn't matter, to force somebody to divorce their sexual orientation from their religious identity and not allowing that sexual identity preference manifesting itself in every aspect of their religious ceremony, including marriage. This is, to me, adding insult to their injury. And quite honestly, religion also, in addition to being a way of life, it's a combination of a revelation or a text or a divine reality, universal truth, which also in conversation with human experience. It never stays as a static. Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, it evolved in conversation, in negotiation with human experience, scientific knowledge, etc. And if some people, as a result of the changing human experience, scientific knowledge, convinced that there is religiously nothing wrong with being gay, I may disagree with him or her. I wouldn't make that negotiation. I wouldn't go there. But I think religious freedom, that's where religious freedom really becomes a real test, litmus test to your morality, your commitment to religious freedom. They should absolutely be given that freedom to religiously, halachically, Christian way, Islamic way, argue for a LGBTQ identity. They should be given that freedom. Not to contradict myself, but at the same time, if you are advocating for that kind of freedom, no, I'm not contradicting myself. In my, I think, religious conviction, I am very clear. But if a person, out of religious conviction, he or she feels his or her religiosity is violated if he or she sells a cake to a same-sex marriage and doesn't want to do that business transaction, that right also should be given to that person. If there is no gay couple cannot find anybody to buy a cake, that's an issue. I don't think in America we will face that problem. If in the capitalist society where I think if somebody says, if I sell you this cake, my religious sensitivities will be offended, I think the basic expectations of decency is go to another cake. Send to the Muslim cake maker. He may be on the same page about gay issue with you, but he would probably say, oh, another customer, welcome. Like, we have to also, as I think you beautifully said, as we charter into some new territories of accommodation and tolerance, we sometimes sort of regress in the achievements that we have made. Everything we built in the religious freedom should be building on top of the previous achievement so that we are not going to be 2 steps forward, 3 steps backwards.
Let me just also add one other thing. You know, different religious traditions have different takes on these issues and also different takes on the extent to which you can be complicit in or associated with this kind of contact. My own sense personally, if I were a baker and a Christian baker, I would say I need to love people and I shouldn't make a distinction on their sexual orientation. But I also understand that there are people for whom that is not religiously open. Religious traditions aren't something that you can just say, oh, I choose differently. You can dialogue, you can discuss, but I think there needs to be respect for that as well. And I think as we wrestle these domains, we will find ways, so we talk to each other, feel each other's pain, we will be able to find pathways forward.
I am on the same page in terms of expectation. But in terms of rights, I think Christianity can benefit a lot from Judaism and Islam if some of the legal thinking gets into this conversation. For example, for a practicing Muslim, I would never sell an alcohol, and I would never be in that business. But if somebody comes and imposes that, no, if you have a restaurant, I want to drink only alcohol here, and you have to sell me, even if I love that person, it's so not fair. Also, legally, it's going to violate certain things in my religion that I have to finish up all my business. I think there is some legal, or it's not about lack of love. I don't feel it that way. I don't think that person who doesn't want to sell cake hates gay people, or may not be. But to assume that is, to me, problematic. I think somebody is asking for a religious space where he doesn't want to involve any business transaction which violates his or her some legal normative part of his or her religion that should be respected.
Yeah. And I think that's what I was saying. Yeah.
I want to take a slightly different approach.
Go ahead, last
Last one? Okay, sorry.
Let the rabbi speak the last word.
Last and least. I think the questions suppose too much of a false dichotomy between religion and equality, and I don't think it's necessarily a healthy one to engage in. And I think the productive way to move forward is to put it in a very specific context and to deal with the actual question that we're asking. The reason the Religious Freedom Restoration Act passed almost unanimously in 1993 was because it was 10 years before Lawrence and 20 years before Windsor and 23 years before Obergefell. It was before we had a national conversation about the harms involved in discriminating against the LGBT community. The way the law works is very, very simple. If a person has a sincerely held religious belief that is being substantially burdened by the government, then unless the government has a compelling reason not to, the government has to give them an exception. But exceptions were never meant to shift the harm to a third party. I can't say that my religion requires me to punch you in the face, right? My religion ends where your nose begins. And I can't violate that. Now, in 1993, we didn't yet think of discrimination against LGBT as a harm, and so we didn't put that factor into the equation. So here's what we're actually dealing with. It's a very simple, concrete legal problem. We're not scrapping religious freedom. We're not scrapping equality. We're asking about updating the definition of the harm section in the RFRA statute. That's a specific contextual problem. That's a small area of tension where we can use creative legal thinking, such as the statewide system of distribution or the freedom of association and expression rights, to mitigate those instances. And instead of indulging in this, I think, media-created idea of there being two completely separate camps that can't deal with each other, if people of good faith and no faith can get around a table in good faith and talk about these issues, we can actually easily and productively move forward.
We're going to before we thank all our panelists tonight, one last comment. I just want you to take in consideration for a moment that you're now sitting in one of the largest, most prestigious historical Baptist churches in Orlando with rabbis, imams, other religious leaders, professors, the diversity that's in the room. And what we hope is that this is beginning, and thanks to First Baptist Church for making this happen. Thank you very much. These are significant events, so we shouldn't take them for granted. We should bless the moments we have, never take them for granted. Thank you for being here tonight, and most importantly, thank you for the insights and the wonderful words shared tonight, thought-provoking comments to continue our conversation. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you. And we want to also say thank you to Hannah, who's off somewhere doing an interview somewhere. So we also wanted to thank her. And we're going to ask the imam, as appropriate, to offer a final prayer, a blessing for us in the diversity of all of our faiths, our traditions. And as we say on our show on Tuesdays at 6:30 on WMFE, we hope that you will continue. This is not the end. This is a continuation of a very, very important conversation.
Before I offer benediction, this program has been recorded, so if you liked it, it will be available soon, that you can link to it and share it with a wider audience. We want this conversation to go everywhere. We want people worldwide to engage in civil conversation, learning about each other. This is what we try to do week in and week out, to learn and to bring guests to educate us, expand our minds. And as the rabbi and other speakers said, more knowledge, more education, more wisdom, and with that we will have more of religious freedom. Let's pray. God Almighty, we thank you for this opportunity to bring all of us from diverse faith and no faith to come together to have a civil conversation where we honor each other as sisters and brothers. God, you accepted for us to be diverse, to have different views, to think about you in different ways and to call you in different ways. We ask you to bless each and every one of us here with your endless blessings, to bless our country, to keep it safe, to keep our freedoms, to help us understand, appreciate, and celebrate those freedoms. Religious freedom is given to us from you, first and foremost, and no one should be able to take it away from us. We will defend each other's freedom to believe as they wish and to practice what they believe. We ask you to help us sort out our differences in a loving and compassionate ways. And we ask you to continue to bless all of us as we depart from this holy place. In your name, amen.
Amen. Thank you. Everybody have a safe, wonderful evening.